In the biting cold of an October night in 1885, Lady Hannah Vance believed she was riding toward freedom. She had stolen her father's fastest stallion, bringing nothing but a handful of coins and a heart full of desperation. She wasn't running from a crime. She was running from a marriage contract signed in blood and debt. She pushed her horse to the breaking point, the wind screaming in her ears, convinced she had finally outsmarted the devil himself. But when she glanced to her left, breathless and triumphant, her heart stopped. She wasn't alone, and the man riding beside her wasn't chasing her. He was matching her pace, waiting for her to realize that there is no escaping the Duke of Blackwood. The clock on the mantelpiece of Greystone Hall struck 2, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel in the silence of the sleeping estate. Lady Hannah Vance stood by the window, her forehead pressed against the cold glass. Outside, the moors of Northumberland were drowning in a torrential downpour, the kind of storm that turned the roads to sludge and kept honest men by their fires. But Hannah had no intention of being honest tonight. She turned back to the mahogany desk where the document lay. The ink was dry, but the stain on her life was fresh. It was a betrothal agreement, dated October 14th, 1885, binding her, Hannah Beatrix Vance, aged 22, to Jonathan Paul, the Duke of Blackwood. Jonathan Paul. The name alone was enough to chill the air in a drawing room. They called him the Iron Duke, not out of military reverence, but because the man owned half the steel mills in the north and had a heart rumored to be cast from the same metal. He was 32, impossibly wealthy, and carried a reputation for ruthlessness that made grown men stutter. And her father, the Earl of Vance, had sold her to him for £50,000. "Forgive me, Papa," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. She picked up the heavy brass letter opener, not to destroy the document, it was legally binding, but to pry open the hidden drawer of her father's desk. Inside lay a small velvet pouch containing her mother's pearls. They were the only leverage she had left. She shoved them into the pocket of her heavy riding coat. She wasn't wearing silk or lace tonight. She was dressed in dark wool breeches stolen from her brother's wardrobe and a thick cloak. She moved silently through the corridors of the ancestral home that was no longer hers. The Vance fortune had been bled dry at the gaming tables of London. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, which was the only reason she could slip out the side scullery door without being seen. The stables smelled of damp hay and leather. Hannah moved toward the stall at the far end. Caspian. The black stallion was the last thing of value her father possessed, and he was the only creature in this world she trusted. "Easy, boy," she murmured, soothing the animal as she quickly saddled him. Her hands shook, fumbling with the buckles. Every second felt like an hour. She knew the train schedule by heart. If she could make it to the station at Berwick-upon-Tweed by dawn, she could take the early train to Edinburgh. From there, a ship to the Americas. She led Caspian out into the rain. The wind hit her like a physical blow, tearing at her cloak. She mounted swiftly, gripping the reins. "Run!" she commanded. They burst forward, the hooves tearing up the sodden earth. Hannah kept her head down, the rain stinging her face. She didn't look back at Greystone Hall. She focused only on the rhythm of the gallop, the exhilarating terror of the escape. Mile after mile, they flew. The adrenaline surged through her veins. She was doing it. She was actually doing it. The suffocating weight of the debt, the looming shadow of the Duke, the pathetic apologies of her father. It was all falling behind her. She reached the stretch of the Great North Road that cut through the dense woods near Alnwick. The trees provided a canopy, darkening the path but shielding her slightly from the rain. She urged Caspian faster. "Come on, nearly there." She was traveling at a breakneck speed, a pace that felt reckless and divine. A smile, wild and hysterical, broke across her face. She was free. Then she heard it. At first, she thought it was an echo, a rhythmic thudding syncing with Caspian's stride. But the tempo was different. Heavier. Hannah stiffened. She risked a glance over her right shoulder. Darkness. Nothing but the churning mud and the swaying trees. It's just the wind, she told herself. Just the storm. She looked forward again, leaning into Caspian's neck. But the sound grew louder. It wasn't behind her. It was to her left. Hannah turned her head, wiping the rain from her lashes. Her breath hitched in her throat. Emerging from the shadow of the tree line, paralleling her course perfectly, was a massive grey stallion. It was a beast of war, its muscles rippling under a slick coat, and riding it was a silhouette that terrified her more than death. He sat deep in the saddle, his posture impossibly calm given the speed at which they were travelling. He wore a long, oilskin duster coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, but a flash of lightning illuminated the sharp, angular jawline and the cold, calculating eyes staring straight ahead. It was Jonathan Paul. He wasn't chasing her. He wasn't shouting for her to stop. He was simply there, riding beside her as if they were taking a leisurely Sunday trot in Hyde Park, despite the fact that they were galloping at 30 miles an hour through a muddy hellscape. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She kicked Caspian. "Go! Faster!" Caspian surged, his nostrils flaring, but the grey stallion matched the burst of speed effortlessly. Jonathan slowly turned his head to look at her. Even through the rain and the dark, she felt the weight of his gaze. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "Lady Hannah," his voice carried over the wind, deep and impossibly steady. "You are going to lame that horse." "Go to hell," she screamed, the wind tearing the words from her mouth. "The road washes out 2 miles ahead at the Rothbury crossing," he shouted back, not raising his voice in anger, but in command. "Pull up. I'd rather drown." He sighed. It was a visible motion, a drop of his shoulders. "Don't be dramatic." He nudged his stallion closer. The massive grey beast crowded Caspian, using its weight to force Hannah's lighter horse toward the edge of the road, where the brush was thick. "Get away!" she cried, lashing out with her riding crop. She missed him by inches. Jonathan didn't flinch. He reached out with a gloved hand, a movement so fast she barely registered it, and grabbed Caspian's bridle, right near the bit. It was a move of immense strength and horsemanship. With a firm, steady pull, he leveraged his own horse's weight to drag Caspian's head down and to the right. "Whoa!" Jonathan commanded. Caspian, sensing the superior force, slowed. Hannah fought it, pulling back, but it was useless. Within 50 yards, the 2 horses came to a snorting, stomping halt in the middle of the muddy road. The silence that followed was filled only by the heavy breathing of the animals and the relentless drumming of the rain. Hannah sat freezing, her chest heaving, water dripping from her nose. She glared at him with pure hatred. Jonathan Paul adjusted his hat. He looked at her, taking in the men's breeches, the lack of a chaperone, and the stolen pearls he likely knew were in her pocket. "An impressive attempt," he said dryly. "However, you missed the train. It left Berwick 10 minutes ago. I own the railway, Hannah. I know the timetable better than you." "You are a monster!" Hannah spat, her hands gripping the rein so tightly her knuckles were white. Jonathan swung his leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground. His boots sank into the mud, but he ignored it. He walked over to Caspian and checked the horse's flanks. "And you are reckless. This animal is blowing hard. He needs a cool down, not a gallop." He looked up at her, his eyes the color of flint. "Get down." "I will not." "Hannah," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I have a carriage following 1/2 a mile behind, with warm blankets and brandy. You are soaking wet, shaking, and currently trespassing on land that, as of this morning, belongs to me. Get down." The revelation hit her like a slap. "This is Vance's land." "Was," he corrected. "Your father signed the deed over at noon to cover the interest on his debts. The betrothal was merely the cherry on top." Defeat, bitter and acid, rose in her throat. She swung her leg over and slid down. Her legs were so numb from the cold and the adrenaline crash that they buckled the moment they hit the ground. She expected to fall into the mud, but strong hands caught her by the elbows. She was hauled up against a chest that felt as solid as a brick wall. She smelled rain, expensive tobacco, and something uniquely masculine, sandalwood and steel. She shoved him away. "Do not touch me." Jonathan released her immediately, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "As you wish. The carriage is approaching." Sure enough, the twin lamps of a black carriage cut through the gloom. It pulled up alongside them, the driver looking terrifyingly stoic. A footman jumped down to take the horses. "Inside," Jonathan gestured. Hannah climbed in, shivering violently now that the adrenaline was gone. The interior was plush, upholstered in dark red velvet and warm. Jonathan followed, closing the door and sealing them in a quiet, dry box. He opened a compartment, poured a small amount of amber liquid into a crystal glass, and held it out. "Poison?" she asked through chattering teeth. "Cognac. Though given your current mood, you'd likely find poison preferable." She took it and downed it in one burning gulp. She coughed, the warmth spreading through her chest. Jonathan sat opposite her, leaning back with an infuriating casualness. He watched her for a long moment. "Why did you run, Hannah? You knew I would find you." "Because I'm not a piece of furniture to be traded to settle a gambling ledger," she snapped. "My father may have lost his spine, but I have not lost mine." "Clearly," Jonathan murmured. "You have spirit, I'll give you that. Most debutantes would have simply wept into their embroidery." "I am not a debutante. I am a prisoner." She looked at him, really looked at him. In the dim light of the carriage lantern, he looked less like a devil and more like a weary king. "What do you want with me, my lord? You have money. You have mistresses. The papers say as much. You have power. Why marry the daughter of a bankrupt earl?" Jonathan looked out the window at the rain-streaked glass. His jaw tightened. "There are requirements for a man in my position. A title requires an heir. An empire requires a hostess. And your bloodline, despite your father's incompetence, is impeccable. So I am a broodmare," she said, her voice hollow. He turned his gaze back to her, sharp and sudden. "You are a duchess, or you will be in 3 days, and you will find, Hannah, that I am a very generous man to those who are loyal, and a very dangerous one to those who are not. And if I refuse, if I scream at the altar, then your father goes to debtor's prison at Marshalsea. Your sister, Sophie, who is currently at finishing school in Switzerland, will be pulled out and forced to work as a governess. Or worse. And you?" He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, bringing his face inches from hers. "You will be left with nothing. No home, no name, no protection." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, hot and angry. "You have thought of everything." "I am a businessman, Hannah. I leave nothing to chance." "Where are we going?" she asked, realizing the carriage was not turning back toward Greystone Hall. "This isn't the way home." "Greystone is no longer your home," Jonathan said simply, "and I cannot return you to your father. He cannot control you. If you ran once, you will run again." So I am taking you to Blackwood Manor." Hannah gasped. Blackwood Manor was his primary seat, deep in the moors, isolated and imposing. To go there, unmarried, without a chaperone, was social suicide. "You will ruin me," she whispered. "We are to be married in 3 days," Jonathan said, leaning back and closing his eyes. "The world already believes you are mine. Let them talk. By the time they finish clutching their pearls, you will be wearing the Blackwood diamonds." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object. He tossed it onto her lap. It was the velvet pouch containing her mother's pearls. Hannah froze. "How? You dropped them when you dismounted," he lied. He hadn't seen her drop them. He had picked her pocket when he caught her from falling, but he preferred she think him observant rather than a thief. "Keep them. They look cheap compared to what I will give you, but I understand sentimental value." Hannah clutched the pearls, her only link to a life that was rapidly disappearing. She looked at the man opposite her, the man who had hunted her down in a storm, who threatened her family, and yet who had caught her before she fell into the mud. She realized then that escaping on horseback was the easy part. The real danger wasn't the storm outside. It was the man sitting across from her. "Sleep, Hannah," he said softly, without opening his eyes. "It's a long ride to your new cage." The carriage wheels crunched over gravel, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into the soles of Hannah's feet. They had been traveling for hours in a silence so dense it felt physical. Jonathan had not slept, nor had he spoken. He had simply watched the rain streak the glass, his profile carved from granite, occasionally checking a silver pocket watch with the initials ST engraved on the lid. When the carriage finally halted, Hannah looked out. She expected a castle, crumbling and gothic, fitting for a monster. What she saw was something far more intimidating. Blackwood Manor was a behemoth of dark stone, but it was alive. Unlike the flickering candles and drafty corridors of her father's greystone hall, Blackwood was ablaze with light. Not the soft, forgiving yellow of tallow, but the stark, brilliant white of electricity. Jonathan Paul was an industrialist, a man of the future, and he had wired his home with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to his steel mills. The house didn't look welcoming. It looked like a machine that never slept. The footman opened the door. "Your Grace," he murmured to Jonathan. Jonathan stepped out and turned, offering his hand to Hannah. She stared at the gloved leather. To take it was to accept his assistance, to accept her defeat. She hesitated, the rain soaking her hair, plastering the stolen breeches to her skin. "The staff is waiting, Hannah," Jonathan said, his voice low. "Do not embarrass yourself by fainting in the mud. Take my hand." She clamped her jaw, placed her cold hand in his, and stepped down. They ascended the wide stone steps. The heavy oak doors were thrown open, revealing a cavernous entrance hall lined with black and white marble. A double line of servants stood at attention, immaculate in black and grey livery. "Welcome home, Your Grace," they chorused in unison. Hannah felt small. She was dressed in men's clothes, smelling of horse and wet wool, standing before a household that operated with military precision. She felt the heat of humiliation rise up her neck. A severe-looking woman with hair pulled back so tightly it pulled at her eyes stepped forward. She wore a ring of keys at her waist that chimed with every step. "Mrs. Galloway," Jonathan nodded to her. "This is Lady Hannah Vance. You will address her as Your Grace, effective immediately." Mrs. Galloway's eyes flicked over Hannah's scandalous attire, but her expression didn't waver. "As you wish, my lord. We have prepared the blue suite in the east wing." "Take her," Jonathan said, unbuttoning his heavy coat and handing it to a waiting footman without looking back. "Burn these clothes, scrub the mud off her, and feed her. She looks like a ghost." He began to walk toward the library, dismissing her as easily as one dismisses a servant. "Jonathan!" Hannah called out. He stopped. The servants froze. The air in the hall seemed to vanish. Nobody addressed the Duke by his Christian name without permission. He turned slowly. Yes? Am I a guest, or am I a prisoner? Jonathan looked at her across the expanse of the marble floor. His eyes were unreadable. You are the future mistress of this house, Hannah. You may go anywhere you please within these walls. But do not mistake freedom of movement for freedom of will. You are here because there is nowhere else for you to go. He turned and disappeared into the library, the heavy doors clicking shut with a finality that echoed in Hannah's bones. 2 hours later, Hannah sat before a vanity mirror in a room that was larger than the entire ground floor of the cottage she had hoped to rent in America. The blue suite was exquisite, silk wallpapers, Persian rugs, a fireplace roaring with birch logs. She had been scrubbed raw by 2 silent maids. The smell of the horse was gone, replaced by rosewater and lemon soap. She now wore a dressing gown of sapphire velvet that Mrs. Galloway had produced from a wardrobe already stocked with clothes in Hannah's size. He knew, she thought, running her hand over the fabric. He knew my measurements. He has been planning this for months. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," she said, expecting Mrs. Galloway with a tray of food. Instead, the door opened to reveal a young man. He was leaning against the doorframe, holding a glass of wine, a lopsided grin on his face. He looked like Jonathan, the same dark hair and sharp jaw, but where Jonathan was hard angles and steel, this man was soft edges and indulgence. His eyes were bleary, his cravat loosened. "So," the man drawled, walking into the room without invitation. "This is the £50,000 prize." Hannah stood up, tightening her robe. "Who are you?" "Arthur Paul," he said, bowing with exaggerated theatricality. "The spare to the heir, the disappointment of the family, and your future brother-in-law." He circled her, his eyes assessing her with a mix of curiosity and pity. "You're prettier than the last one," he considered. The coal baron's daughter had teeth like a horse. "Get out of my room," Hannah said coldly. Arthur laughed, feisty. "I like that. You'll need that fire, darling. Living with Jonathan is like living in a mausoleum. The man doesn't feel. He calculates. He didn't marry you for love, you know." "I am well aware of the transaction," Hannah replied, lifting her chin. £50,000 to clear my father's debts." Arthur stopped circling. He took a sip of his wine, his expression darkening. "Is that what he told you? 50,000? He chuckled darkly. "That was just the down payment, sweetheart. Jonathan didn't just pay your father's debts. He bought the promissory notes 3 months ago from the lenders in London. He held the debt over your father's head to force the marriage." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. That's a lie." "Is it?" Arthur shrugged. "Ask him. Jonathan doesn't lie. He considers it inefficient. He orchestrated the whole thing. He wanted the Vance bloodline to legitimize his industrial money, and he cornered your father like a rat in a trap." Arthur finished his wine and set the glass on her vanity, leaving a wet ring on the polished wood. "Be careful, Hannah," Arthur whispered, leaning in close. "My brother collects beautiful things, but he has a habit of breaking them if they don't work the way he wants." He turned and sauntered out of the room, leaving the door ajar. Hannah stood frozen. The warmth of the fire suddenly felt suffocating. If Arthur was telling the truth, this wasn't just a marriage of convenience to save her family. It was a hostile takeover. Jonathan hadn't saved her from ruin. He had engineered the ruin to acquire her. She walked to the window and looked out at the storm, which was still raging over the moors. The electric lights of the manor reflected in the glass, turning the window into a mirror. She saw herself, clean, dressed in velvet, and utterly trapped. "Very well, Jonathan," she whispered to her reflection. "You want a duchess? You shall have one. But you will wish you had bought the coal baron's daughter instead." The wedding took place 3 days later in the private chapel on the Blackwood estate. It was a grim, stone structure that smelled of damp earth and ancient incense. There were no flowers. There was no music, save for the drone of the organ played by a local village clerk. The pews were empty. Hannah's father had not come. Jonathan had told her, with a cruel lack of emotion, that the Earl was indisposed with shame and had retreated to his hunting lodge in Scotland. Hannah knew the truth. Her father couldn't face her. He had sold her, took the money, and ran. She stood at the altar, wearing a gown of heavy ivory silk that Jonathan had commissioned. It was beautiful, encrusted with seed pearls and lace, but the bodice was tight, the boning digging into her ribs like a cage. A diamond choker, cold and heavy, sat at her throat, the Blackwood family heirloom. It felt less like jewelry and more like a collar. Jonathan stood beside her. He wore a black morning coat, his posture rigid. He looked devastatingly handsome, in the way a storm cloud is beautiful before it destroys a harvest. He did not look at her. He stared straight ahead at the vicar, a nervous man named Reverend Thomas, who seemed terrified of the Duke. "Do you?" the Reverend stammered. "Jonathan Alexander Paul, Duke of Blackwood, take this woman." "I do," Jonathan said. His voice was clear, void of hesitation, void of joy. It was a statement of fact. "And do you?" The Reverend turned to Hannah, sweating. "Hannah Beatrix Vance." Hannah hesitated. The silence in the chapel stretched. She could hear the rain tapping against the stained glass windows. She looked at Jonathan's profile. He didn't turn to her, but she saw a muscle in his jaw twitch. He was waiting for her to run again. He was waiting for the scene. He wants me to fight, she realized, because if I fight, he can conquer me. If I submit, he has nothing to push against. "I do," she said softly. The ring he slid onto her finger was a heavy gold band with a single, massive sapphire that looked like a bruised eye. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend exhaled, clearly relieved the ceiling hadn't collapsed. "Your Grace, you may kiss the bride." Jonathan turned to her then. He lifted her veil. His eyes searched hers, looking for fear, for tears. Hannah stared back, dry-eyed and cold. He leaned in. She expected brutality. She expected him to claim her roughly to prove a point. Instead, his lips brushed hers with a shocking gentleness. It was a chaste, barely there contact that lasted less than a second, but the heat of his breath against her skin made her shiver. He pulled back, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "Come," he said, offering his arm. "Dinner is served." The wedding reception was a dinner for 3 in the grand dining room. The table was long enough to seat 30, but it was just Jonathan at the head, Hannah to his right, and Arthur to his left. The atmosphere was toxic. "To the happy couple," Arthur raised his glass, already on his 3rd serving of wine. "May your union be as warm as this room." He shivered dramatically. The room was, in fact, draughty. Jonathan ignored him, cutting his pheasant with surgical precision. "Arthur, if you cannot be civil, you can eat in the stables." "Just trying to lighten the mood, brother," Arthur smirked. "It feels like a funeral in here. Hannah, don't you agree?" Hannah looked at her plate. "I am not hungry." "Eat," Jonathan commanded gently. "You are too thin." "I lost my appetite when I lost my freedom," she replied, taking a sip of water. Jonathan placed his knife and fork down. The sound of the silver hitting the china rang out like a gunshot. "We have a guest arriving for dessert," Jonathan said, changing the subject. "Lord Reginald Calloway." Arthur choked on his wine. "Calloway? Here. Why in God's name would you invite that vulture?" "Business," Jonathan said. "He owns the shipping lines I need for the steel export to America. He will be congratulating us." 10 minutes later, the doors opened, and Lord Calloway was announced. He was a man in his 60s, rotund, with a face flushed red from years of port and a white mustache that twitched when he smiled. "Your Grace," Calloway boomed, walking in, "and the new Duchess. My word, Jonathan, you have outdone yourself. She is a vision." He took Hannah's hand and kissed it, his lips wet and lingering too long. Hannah pulled her hand back. "Lord Calloway," she nodded. Calloway took the seat opposite her. As coffee was served, the men began to talk of tariffs and tonnage. Hannah felt invisible, a decoration at her own wedding feast. However, as Jonathan became embroiled in a debate with Arthur about the management of the Western mills, Calloway leaned across the table toward Hannah. "You must forgive the shop talk, my dear." Calloway lowered his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Jonathan is a man of singular focus. It is how he acquires everything he wants." "He is very dedicated," Hannah said neutrally. "Dedicated?" "Yes." Calloway's eyes twinkled with malice. "I was surprised, you know. When I heard he bought the Vance debt, I told him, 'Jonathan, why buy the debt? Just let the Earl go bankrupt and buy the daughter a dress.' But Jonathan insisted. He wanted leverage." Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. It confirmed what Arthur had said. "He told me," Calloway continued, sipping his coffee and glancing at Jonathan to ensure he wasn't listening, "that the Vance name was the only thing clean enough to wash the soot off his money. He said he'd pay double the debt just to own the pedigree, a calculated investment, cold but brilliant." Hannah felt bile rise in her throat. She looked at Jonathan. He was arguing passionately about worker safety with Arthur, his face animated. He looked human, but Calloway's words painted him as a sociopath who had purchased her, like a prize horse, to improve his stable's reputation. She stood up abruptly. The chair legs scraped loudly against the floor. The men stopped talking. "Hannah?" Jonathan looked up, concerned. I am unwell," she stammered. "The excitement of the day. I must retire." Jonathan stood immediately. "I will escort you." "No!" The word came out too sharp. She softened it. "No, please, stay with your guest. I need to be alone." She turned and fled the room before he could stop her. She ran to the blue suite, slamming the door and locking it. She leaned against the wood, breathing hard. He calculated it. He planned it. "I am nothing but a transaction." She paced the room, her anger burning away the fear. She stopped at the window. Below, in the courtyard, the rain had stopped. The moon was breaking through the clouds. She saw a figure walking in the garden below. It was Jonathan. He had left his guests. He was walking slowly, smoking a cheroot. He stopped by a stone fountain and looked up. He looked straight at her window. Hannah stepped back into the shadows, but she knew he had seen her. She waited. She expected him to come up. It was their wedding night after all. By law, by right, and by expectation, he should be coming to claim what he had paid for. She sat on the edge of the massive four-poster bed, her hands gripping the sheets. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. 1 hour passed, then 2. At midnight, she heard a soft sound at the door. A piece of paper was slid underneath. Hannah waited, then crept forward and picked it up. It was a note, written in a sharp, angular hand. "Hannah." The door to your adjoining room is unlocked, but I have locked mine from the inside. You are safe. I do not take what is not freely given. Sleep well. S. Hannah stared at the note. He wasn't coming. She should have been relieved. She should have thanked God that the monster was keeping his distance. But as she lay in the massive, cold bed, clutching the note, she felt a strange confusion. A monster who engineered her family's ruin would not spare her dignity on her wedding night. A monster would take his prize. Unless Arthur and Calloway were wrong, or unless Jonathan Paul was playing a much deeper, darker game, one where he wanted her mind and her heart, not just her body, and that terrified her more than anything. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, but sleep did not come. She lay awake, listening to the wind, wondering who was the wolf and who was the prey in the house of Blackwood. November descended on Northumberland like a shroud. The rain turned to sleet, and the moors became a landscape of bruised purples and greys. Inside Blackwood Manor, the atmosphere was no warmer. For 3 weeks, Hannah and Jonathan lived as ghosts haunting the same castle. They had established a routine, a silent choreography of avoidance. Breakfast was served at 7 sharp. Hannah would arrive at 7:15 to find Jonathan already halfway through his correspondence, a cup of black coffee untouched at his elbow. He would stand when she entered, a reflex of manners he couldn't suppress, nod his head and say, "Good morning, Hannah." "Your Grace," she would reply, taking her seat at the far end of the table. That was the extent of their marriage. But beneath the silence, Hannah was watching. She was learning the rhythms of the enemy. She learned that Jonathan slept little, often pacing the library floor until 3 in the morning. She learned that he treated his servants with a quiet, exacting respect that confused her. He knew the names of their children and paid for their medical bills. It did not fit the profile of the monster Calloway had described. "It is a mask," she told herself, staring at him over the silver toast rack. "He buys loyalty, just as he bought me." The opportunity she had been waiting for arrived on a Tuesday. A crisis at the main steelworks in Newcastle required Jonathan's immediate presence. A boiler had exploded, injuring 3 men. Jonathan's face had gone ashen when the telegram arrived. He had ordered his horse, not the carriage, it was too slow, and ridden out into the sleet without a coat, shouting orders to the doctor to follow him. The moment the heavy front doors slammed shut, Hannah moved. She dismissed the maids, claiming a headache, and waited until the house was silent. Then she slipped into the West Wing. Jonathan's study was a forbidden zone. It smelled of sandalwood, old paper, and the faint, acrid scent of coal dust. It was a room of industry, not leisure. Maps of the railways covered the walls, pinned with red flags. Hannah went straight to the massive oak desk. It was locked, of course. But Hannah remembered something. The night of the wedding, when Jonathan had taken off his coat to give to the footman, she had heard the heavy jingle of keys in the pocket. He had worn a different coat today, the rougher tweed he used for riding. She ran to the coat stand in the corner. His black morning coat hung there, forgotten. Her fingers fumbled into the pockets. Click. Her fingers closed around a cold ring of iron keys. She rushed back to the desk. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. If Mrs. Galloway walked in now, if Arthur saw her... She tried the first key. It stuck. The second. Too small. The third turned with a smooth, well-oiled slide. The drawer slid open. Inside, there were no stacks of gold or scandalous love letters. There were ledgers, rows and rows of financial records. She flipped through them, her eyes scanning for the name Vance. She found nothing in the ledgers. She dug deeper, reaching to the back of the drawer. Her fingers brushed against a false bottom, a piece of wood that felt slightly loose. She pried it up with her fingernail. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. Hannah untied them, her hands shaking. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was her father's, spiky, erratic, desperate. She opened the first one, dated 6 months ago. To His Grace, the Duke of Blackwood, I implore you to reconsider the terms. If the truth of the Cheviot matter comes to light, it will not only be my ruin but a stain on the entire peerage. I require the funds immediately. Silence is expensive, Jonathan. Vance Hannah frowned. Silence is expensive. It sounded like her father was demanding money. But why? She opened the next one, dated 2 months ago. You bleed me dry, Vance. But I will pay. I will pay to keep the name clean. But this is the last time. The deed to the land is not enough. I want assurance. This one was a copy of a draft written in Jonathan's hand. She picked up the final document. It was the betrothal agreement, but clipped to it was a private memorandum written by Jonathan's lawyer, Mr. Sterling. Memorandum: the Vance acquisition. Subject: containment. Summary: the Earl threatens exposure of the 1860 scandal. The Duke has agreed to the merger, marriage, as a means of legally sealing the Earl's assets and silencing him. The daughter is collateral. She must not know the nature of the transaction. Hannah dropped the paper. The room seemed to spin. The daughter is collateral. The words burned into her retinas. Arthur and Calloway had been right. Jonathan hadn't just bought her debt. He had been locked in a blackmail war with her father. Her father had known some dark secret about the Blackwood family, the 1860 scandal, and had been using it to extort money from Jonathan. And Jonathan's solution? Marry the daughter. Take control of the family. Silence the blackmailer by becoming his legal guardian. She wasn't a wife. She was a gag order. Collateral, she whispered, the tears finally spilling over. I am just a lock on a vault. She heard footsteps in the hall, heavy, limping footsteps. Hannah shoved the papers back into the false bottom, slammed the drawer shut, and locked it. She threw the keys back into the coat pocket just as the door handle turned. She spun around, grabbing a book from the shelf, a treatise on metallurgy, and pretended to be reading. It wasn't Jonathan. It was Arthur. He stood in the doorway, leaning on a cane, his face pale. He looked at her, then at the desk, then back to her. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Learning about steel, sister? Arthur asked, stepping into the room. Or looking for the rust? I was just... Hannah's voice trembled. She cleared her throat. I was looking for something to read. Arthur closed the door behind him. The click was soft, but it sounded like a prison cell locking. You found them, didn't you? Hannah froze. I don't know what you mean. The letters, Arthur said, walking closer. The ones in the false bottom. He keeps all his sins there. Hannah stared at him. You knew? I know everything that happens in this house, Hannah. I know my brother is a tyrant who thinks he can buy the silence of the world. Arthur reached out and gently took the book from her hands. He placed it on the desk. The question is, now that you know you are nothing but a pawn in his game, what are you going to do about it? The seed of betrayal, once planted, grows with terrifying speed. For 2 days, Hannah carried the secret like a physical weight. Every time Jonathan looked at her, she saw the word collateral stamped on his forehead. When he returned from the steelworks, exhausted, with soot in his hair and a bandage on his hand from helping the workers, she didn't feel the pang of sympathy she might have felt before. She felt only the cold suspicion of a victim. He was playing a role. The benevolent industrialist, the patient husband. It was all to hide the 1860 scandal, whatever that was. On Thursday afternoon, Arthur found her in the conservatory. The glass room was filled with exotic orchids that Jonathan had imported, blooms that looked like alien creatures, beautiful but parasitic. "He's going to London tomorrow," Arthur said, stripping a dead leaf from a fern. Hannah looked up from her needlepoint. She hadn't done a stitch in 20 minutes. "Who?" "Jonathan. He's meeting with the board of directors of the railway. They are voting on his chairmanship." Arthur paused, looking at her significantly. "If he remains chairman, he gains absolute control over the North. No one will ever be able to touch him. Or you. Why are you telling me this?" Arthur sat beside her on the iron bench. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because, Hannah, I can't stand to see you in this cage, and because I know what the 1860 scandal is." Hannah's breath hitched. "Tell me." "Our father," Arthur said, his eyes looking distant and pained. "The previous duke. He didn't die of a heart attack, as the papers said. He killed a man, a union leader who refused to break a strike. Jonathan was just a boy, but he saw it. The family covered it up. Your father found out. He's been bleeding Jonathan for years." "Jonathan is protecting a murderer?" Hannah asked, horrified. "Jonathan is the murderer's legacy," Arthur corrected. "He is continuing the cycle. He uses the profits from the mills to pay off the witnesses. He is corrupt, Hannah, to the bone." Arthur took her hand. His palm was damp. "If the board knew, if they saw proof that the Duke is subject to blackmail, that his finances are compromised, they would vote him out. He would lose his power. He would be just a man. And you could file for an annulment based on fraud." "An annulment?" The word hung in the humid air. "Freedom. But I need proof," Arthur said. "I need the letters." Hannah pulled her hand away. "You want me to steal from him?" "I want you to save yourself," Arthur pleaded, "and save the company from a tyrant. I can run the business, Hannah. I can make it humane, but not while he holds the crown." That night, the silence of the manor felt different. It felt like the breath before a scream. Jonathan came to her room before dinner. He knocked. He always knocked, and entered. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes were etched deep. "I am leaving for London in the morning," he said. "I will be gone for 3 days." "I know," Hannah said, turning away from her mirror. She couldn't look him in the eye. He hesitated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I saw this in Newcastle, in an antique shop window. It reminded me of you." He placed it on the vanity. Hannah didn't move to open it. "Hannah," he said softly, "I know this life is not what you wanted. I know you hate me. But I am trying, in my own way, to make it bearable." He waited for her to speak. When she didn't, he turned and walked to the door. "Good night." As soon as he was gone, Hannah tore open the package. It was a music box, tiny, made of silver and mother of pearl. She wound the key. It played a sad, lilting tune, "The Last Rose of Summer." It was her mother's favorite song. How did he know? For a moment, her resolve wavered. The gift was thoughtful, almost tender. But then she remembered the memo. The daughter is collateral. He is manipulating you, she thought fiercely. He is buying your affection with trinkets while he hides the truth. She waited until midnight. Then she moved. The theft was easier the second time. Her hands were steady with the cold certainty of justice. She took the letters. She took the memo. She took the proof of the blackmail. She met Arthur in the shadows of the scullery hallway. He was dressed for travel. "Do you have them?" he whispered. Hannah handed him the packet. "Promise me," she said. gripping his sleeve. "Promise me this will just remove him from the board. You won't send him to prison." Arthur's eyes gleamed in the dark. He snatched the letters. "I promise, Hannah. I just want justice. Go back to bed. When you wake up, everything will be different." He kissed her on the cheek, a cold, dry peck, and vanished into the night. The next morning, Jonathan left at dawn. Hannah watched from her window as his carriage disappeared down the drive. She felt a sick, hollow sensation in her stomach. The day passed in a blur. The house felt empty, but it was a different kind of empty. It felt unprotected. At tea time, Mrs. Galloway came in. She looked distressed. "Your Grace," she said, "there is a situation." "What is it?" "A letter has arrived for the Duke. But since he is gone, and it is marked urgent family matter, I thought you should see it." She handed Hannah a telegram. Hannah unfolded it. It was from Switzerland, from the headmistress of her sister Sophie's finishing school, to the Duke of Blackwood. "Stop. Funds received. Sophie Vance tuition paid in full for next 3 years. Stop. Also trust fund established in her name per your instructions. Stop. Your generosity has secured her future independent of her father. Stop. God bless you." Hannah stared at the paper. The words swam before her eyes. Independent of her father. Jonathan hadn't just paid the debts. He had set up a trust fund for Sophie. He had paid 3 years of tuition up front. He had done it secretly. Why would a monster do that? Why would a man who viewed them as collateral ensure Sophie was free from their father's control? A terrible, icy dread began to pool in Hannah's gut. She ran to the study. She didn't care about the keys anymore. She needed to see the ledgers again. She unlocked the drawer and pulled out the main ledger she had ignored before. She turned to the dates of the blackmail payments. October 14th, $50,000 paid to Earl of Vance. Note, purchase of debt. October 15th, $10,000 paid to private investigators. Note, gathering evidence of Earl's embezzlement of Crown funds to prevent him from implicating Hannah. Hannah gasped. She flipped the page. November 1st, memo from Mr. Sterling, lawyer. Your Grace, we have successfully suppressed the story of the Earl's theft. If the Crown found out he stole the regiment's pension fund, he would hang. Your purchase of the debt and the marriage has legally shielded him. You have effectively taken the bullet for the Vance family. But I must warn you, if the board finds out you used company funds to cover a criminal's tracks, even for noble reasons, they will crucify you. The world tilted on its axis. Arthur had lied. Calloway had lied. The 1860 scandal wasn't about Jonathan's father killing a man. That was the lie Arthur spun. The real secret was her own father's crime, stealing pension funds from soldiers. Jonathan hadn't blackmailed her father. Her father had stolen from the Crown, and Jonathan had stepped in, paid the debt, and married Hannah to give her the protection of his title so the scandal wouldn't destroy her life. He had called her collateral in the memo to his lawyer to justify the expense commercially, so the lawyer wouldn't think he was acting out of sentiment. He wasn't the villain, he was the shield, and she had just handed the proof of his misuse of funds to the man who wanted to destroy him. Oh God, Hannah whispered, clapping a hand over her mouth. Arthur. She heard the sound of a carriage thundering up the driveway. It was moving fast. Too fast. She ran to the window. It wasn't Jonathan. It was a police wagon, and behind it, Arthur's carriage. Arthur stepped out. He wasn't alone. He was with Lord Calloway and 2 officers. They weren't here for Jonathan. They were here to seize the estate. Arthur looked up at the window. He saw Hannah, and for the first time, he didn't smile. He looked at her with the cold, dead eyes of a man who had finally won. Hannah turned and ran. She didn't run to hide. She ran toward the stables. She had to get to London. She had to stop the vote. She had to save the man she had just destroyed. The irony was not lost on Hannah as she saddled Caspian. A month ago, she had ridden this horse to escape Jonathan Paul. Now, she was riding to save him. She caught the express train to London by seconds, bribing the conductor with the very pearls Jonathan had returned to her. The journey was an agony of pacing and prayer. When she arrived at the frantic streets of the capital, she didn't wait for a carriage. She ran. She burst into the boardroom of the North Eastern Railway Company, just as Lord Calloway was speaking. The room was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, looking like a king facing the guillotine, stoic, silent, and utterly alone. Arthur stood pointing a finger at him, the stolen letters in his hand. "Gentlemen," Arthur sneered, "the evidence is irrefutable. The Duke embezzled company funds to pay off a blackmailer. He is compromised." "Stop!" Every head turned. Hannah stood in the doorway, her hair wind-blown, her dress travel-stained. "Hannah!" Jonathan stood, his voice cracking for the first time. "Get out! This is no place for you." "No," she said, walking to the head of the table. She trembled, not with fear, but with the ferocity of her realization. She looked at the board. The Duke did not embezzle funds to hide his own crime. He used his own money to hide mine. A gasp went through the room. Jonathan's eyes widened. "Hannah, do not do this." She ignored him. "The crime Arthur speaks of," she pointed at her brother-in-law, whose smug smile was faltering, "was committed by my father, the Earl of Vance. He stole pension funds from the Crown. Jonathan Paul paid the debt to keep my father from prison and to save my sister and me from destitution. He bought silence not to protect himself, but to protect his wife." She slammed the telegram about Sophie's trust fund onto the table. "Here is the proof. He is not a thief. He is the most honorable man in this room. And if you remove him, you are not removing a criminal. You are removing a savior." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Calloway looked at the telegram, then at Arthur. The narrative had shifted. Jonathan wasn't a corrupt tycoon. He was a chivalrous protector. "Arthur," Lord Calloway said coldly. "Did you know this?" Arthur stammered. It doesn't matter." The money was mine to spend," Jonathan said, his voice returning to its steel-like calm. He looked at Hannah with an intensity that burned, "and I would spend it again." The vote was unanimous. Jonathan remained chairman. Arthur was stripped of his position and escorted out, cursing, into the London fog. Outside, the rain had begun to fall again. Jonathan found Hannah standing by the carriage, shivering. He stopped inches from her. He didn't touch her. He simply looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You destroyed your family name to save me," he said huskily. "Why?" "Because I finally read the ledgers properly," Hannah whispered. "You didn't buy me, Jonathan. You redeemed me." She stepped closer, looking up into his slate-grey eyes. "I tried to escape you, because I thought you were the cage. I didn't realize you were the shelter." Jonathan broke. The Iron Duke finally melted. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her neck, holding her with a desperation that told her he would never let go. "Let's go home, Hannah," he murmured against her skin. "To Blackwood." "Yes," she replied, resting her head against his chest. "Let's go home." And so, the scandal that threatened to tear apart the North became the foundation of its strongest union. Hannah Vance and Jonathan Paul returned to Northumberland not as adversaries, but as partners. The Iron Duke softened, and the Duchess found that the terrifying vastness of the moors was not a prison, but a kingdom she now ruled beside the only man who had ever truly known her worth. They say if you visit the ruins of Blackwood today, you can still hear the echo of two horses galloping side by side, not in a chase, but in perfect rhythm. And that is the story of how a getaway ride turned into a rescue mission. It's a reminder that sometimes the villain in our story is actually the hero we haven't understood yet. If you enjoyed this journey through the stormy moors of 1885, please hit that like button. It helps us bring more of these lost legends to life. What did you think of Hannah's sacrifice? Would you have exposed your family secrets to save your spouse? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss next week's story, where we uncover a royal scandal that was buried for a century. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next chapter.